Welcome to the 30-day novel NaNoWriMo series. This is day 20. My name is Lynn Johnston and I blog at writesmarternotharder.com. You're pretty used to me saying it by now, but one of the things we want to look at first is how you are going to move your story forward today. Today we will be seeing a little bit of growth triggered by the second pinch point. The protagonist and his or her forces learn something during the second pinch point that is going to allow them to grow in some way. Maybe it gives them a better strategy, maybe it helps them identify new resources, maybe it just puts them in a better mindset or strengthens their determination so that they're a little bit more hopeful and a little more focused on going after the antagonist. And remember, the second pinch point propels the characters toward the second plot point, which is another big conflict with the antagonist, only it's a more proactive conflict. So your protagonist, how did your protagonist's understanding of his flaw or wound or defining trauma change as a result of the second pinch point? Remember, there was some awareness that was raised of how that flaw or wound or trauma was affecting the protagonist's life. The protagonist inner conflict was triggered by what happened in the second pinch point, and now that the protagonist has come out of that, there should be some new understanding or new insight, or maybe just even your protagonist might be just a little more comfortable with the fact that they are the way they are and that they're struggling with this thing that they're struggling with. Maybe they're not further along in terms of growing, but they have achieved a little bit of distance and then go like, okay, yeah, at least I know that's my problem. Maybe I haven't fixed it, but I'm aware of it. And also you want to ask yourself, how does this new understanding cause your protagonist to update their plan for defeating the antagonist? At this point, your protagonist has come quite a ways in their journey. They've gone through multiple steps in their character growth arc. The way that they were probably seeing their story goal and the antagonist at the beginning of the story and during the first plot point is probably pretty different than how they're seeing it now because they've come so far. Your other characters, how are they reacting to whatever injuries, burdens, and losses that they experienced during the second pinch point? Your protagonist is going to be recovering also. But there's a lot of potential conflict in having your non-protagonist characters reacting to their injuries and their burdens and their losses and having their problems as a result of the second pinch point create new obstacles for the protagonist. Maybe your protagonist is having to make a decision right now. Do I leave this injured comrade behind, or do I take him with me but slow down a lot? Or maybe one of your secondary characters committed to helping someone out during the second pinch point, and now your protagonist has to make good on that other character's promise. It doesn't always have to be positive, but it has to be an obstacle. It has to be more work, whether it's positive or negative for the protagonist. And often positive things, resources, and allies that your protagonist is collecting can initially seem like losses and burdens. For example, maybe your protagonist loses a character who's important to their plan. Maybe he's the only one who can pick the lock in the antagonist's vault. But maybe he was also a big burden in ways that the protagonist was overlooking. Maybe getting rid of him, even though it means they're going to have to find another way to get into the vault, was actually a good thing for the success of the protagonist's journey. Or maybe the protagonist is having to take care of this new person who is another mouth to feed right now, because maybe the protagonist's best friend promised this girl, okay, we're going to take care of you. You can come with us. It's going to be okay. Now the protagonist has to figure out how to feed her and keep her safe, but maybe she's the one who's going to get them into the vault later. We're going to discover that she's got some sort of hidden talent. So this is a good time to give your characters problems, but also think about the hidden positive and negative sides of those problems. Like, how could some of those problems become resources later, or put the characters in a position of obtaining more resources later. and they're going to probably need those resources at the climax. So this is also a good time to think about what your protagonist and his forces needs to defeat the antagonist. Anything he doesn't have yet that he needs at your climax when he's in that final showdown with the antagonist, you need to think now about how to make sure he gets it. How do you set that up? So looking at the conflict in your story, how did the protagonist and his or her allies demonstrate increased commitment to their goal? How did they up their game against the antagonist? How do they update their plan? I apologize for the misspelling there. But how do they update their plan? What new strategies are they going to add? Do they have new information that they won? Maybe they took a great loss in the second pinch point, but in the process they also learned about the antagonist's weakness. And also ask yourself, what is your antagonist doing right now? Now that he or she seems to be winning or seems to have the upper hand, is your antagonist relaxing a little bit and saying, okay, I got that taken care of. That protagonist is not dumb enough to come and try and storm my castle now. Or maybe your antagonist is like, oh man, I was underestimating the protagonist. I am doubling security as of right now. So whatever happened in the second pinch point of your story, you want to think about how it's causing the antagonist to change what they're doing as well. And maybe we don't see what the antagonist is doing, positively or negatively, but we need to know that it's happening so that later, when you get to the second plot point and the dark moment and the climax, we'll know what the antagonist has been up to, so we'll have plenty of obstacles waiting for the protagonist at those plot points. Looking at your setting, what elements in the setting do the protagonist and his or her allies now recognize as useful? And what elements in the setting do they know they need to avoid or treat differently? Story promise. What have you already promised the reader in terms of the character's growth? Just think about it. Make sure you're still moving that forward and keeping that consistent. Getting started, as always, do what you need to do to get into the writing mindset. It's not uncommon at this point in your story to lose focus. You're at about the 2/3 point. Chuck Wendig just posted a great blog a few days ago. I encourage you to check out his blog, terribleminds.com, where he basically talks about loathing your story. And at certain points in your story, you start to hate what you're writing, or you feel like it's terrible, or you just want to give up. And he says it happens at about the 1/3 point, the halfway point, and the 2/3 point. And it's not a coincidence that those are three of the most difficult points in the middle of your story. The 1/3 point is going to be your first pinch point, and that's like the first big thing of character growth, where your character really starts to grow. The midpoint is the game-changing moment, which involves the protagonist having a change of perspective. And then at the 2/3 point, you're at the second pinch point, and again, that's a big step or hurdle for your character, your protagonist, to go through their character arc. And character arc is tough. It is tough to show someone being one way and changing their minds over a period of time. It's a process that is not transparent to us in real life. We often aren't paying attention to ourselves when we're going through the process of growing. We tend to pay attention to the crises that kick the process of growth off, and we tend to pay attention to the end point. So that's basically like the inciting incident or the first plot point of your story and the climax of your story. Those are the parts that we pay attention to in our own personal stories. We don't pay attention to a lot of the stuff that happens in between, because it tends to be a little bit more subtle, and it tends to involve multiple small adjustments to our thinking and smaller experiences that are maybe not as traumatic, but that force us to deal with inner conflict. And honestly, dealing with inner conflict is usually what you're doing when you're unhappy. You don't like to pay attention to what's happening when you're unhappy. But if you do, it will teach you how to handle your character's growth arc, because your character's growth arc is basically a very abbreviated, stylized version of what we all go through when life drags us kicking and screaming into changing. So, I want to say it's not uncommon to lose focus here. I'm not the only person who has that experience. We all do at some point in the middle of our story. And I think Chuck is very, very dead on there in terms of like it being the third, the half, and the 2/3 points. And I don't think that's a coincidence because I think those are the hardest plot points to pull off in your story. So I want to tell you, stay strong, commit to keeping your story on track. If you're not sure exactly what the middle of your story should be like, and you're struggling and you're reaching for how to show your characters growing, do the best you can and move through it because you're going to fix that in edits. That's the other thing about the character growth arc. It's harder to see it when you're writing it, but when you are editing, especially once you've got some emotional distance from the story, if you've set it aside for a month or two, or even a few weeks, so that you've disconnected a little bit from your protagonist, because you have to be connected to your characters when you're writing them. You don't have to be connected to them when you're editing. So do the best you can. Make a note to yourself what you're trying to do if you think that your scenes didn't accomplish it, and just move on, finish the story, and get the external story down. And when you go back to edit, you can really focus on those 3 points, the 2 pinch points and the midpoint, and really look at how your character is being challenged by external events, how the people are basically calling him on his bullshit when your character is in denial, how the people around him are basically saying, well, you know what your problem is, which we all love to hear, right? But when your character is experiencing those at these 3 pivotal points in his or her growth arc, you can strengthen that. You can make it more obvious. You can add interior monologue where the character has a realization like, oh my gosh, my sidekick is totally right. I do that and it's wrong and I need to stop. Or you can add fights that the character has with other characters that show the character's internal conflict through dialogue. Or you can look at the events and you can tweak them a little bit so that they trigger the character more strongly and force the character to really think about why they do what they do and why it's working or not working for them. So don't let the fact that the character growth arc is hard stop you from finishing your story. Keep on with the story. It's all fixable. Everything can be edited. And you can go back, you can write new scenes in edits. You don't have to get every scene right. You don't even have to get every scene in your story. Honestly, the first draft, the goal of it is just to get enough scenes on the paper that are good enough that you can see the picture of your whole novel and get enough of a clear vision of what you've got so far so that you can start adding to it. After you write, always celebrate your progress. Always prepare for tomorrow. Clean off your desk. Get your tools ready. If you absolutely have to have gummy bears to write or a cup of hot tea and you're out of gummy bears and hot tea, go to the store and get them tonight. Do whatever you need to do to set yourself up so that tomorrow you have a 100% chances of success in getting your words down. Thanks for hanging out. Happy writing today, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.